Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And joining me today is co host Victor Kinzer. And we're going to talk about Dark Ages Fae, what it is, and also how to include Dark Ages Fae in a contemporary game. Because you can play it in Dark Ages. You can have them as players, you can have them as antagonists, you can have them as inspiration. But what if the Four Courts, the Inanimate, and the Firstborn were still running around now causing all sorts of shenanigans? I think that's a cool option. So, Victor, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It was super exciting to dig back into Dark Ages Fae. It's my favorite corner of Changeling that a lot of Changeling players get angry about. So it's nice to be able to leave all that baggage aside and talk about it in Mage.
Yeah, I feel like the Dark Ages games form the weirdest family reunion. Like, they all look at each other and we're like, yeah, we get each other. But they do the larger family reunion and everyone's like, oh, no, they're the weird ones. So, and I'm fine with that. Like, it's okay that it doesn't flow together. I like the theory that some people did pillar magic and some people had sphere magic or something like that. And they were just this weird little war of ideas in between. So.
Well, and we have contemporary pillar magic. I mean, that is a thing.
We have what is it? The Indran or the Itaraja Talmahira True Black, which is a fun book.
It is a fun book. Yeah,
I want death mages and an abomination werewolf and a guy who has a gun powered by silkworms. Can we do that all in one book in hardcover? Yes, we
absolutely.
Can. Yes, we can, idiot. I don't know why you asked. Jeez. This is a trick question because normally when I say this, what do you play in blank? You get one answer. But here, it's messy. So, Victor, what do you play in the game Dark Ages Fae?
You play fairies is the easy answer. The hard answer is there isn't one axis of splats in this game. Most World of Darkness games, you pick. It's called a splat because in early drafts, you'd get the asterisks there. It looked like a splat. And then they'd eventually put in clan, tribe, tradition, convention, whatever. Well, in Dark Ages Fae, you have your seeming, you have the type of Fae you are, and then you have the court. And you pick both of them, and they're both written up as full splats. So you either play one of the Firstborn. We're going to put an asterisk on Firstborn because the book acknowledges that they're not really the Firstborn. And they are fairies that emerged from the mists. In Mage terms, the easiest way to describe the mists, the way they are in this book, is the mists are quintessence. They are raw, unshaped potential that you make into reality with your magic. It's quintessence with a very specific fairy flavor on it. And the Firstborn just came out of the mists. And they make everything from the mists, and everything comes from nothing. They just create and create and create and create. They don't destroy anymore, not really, and that's a major plot point. So you either play them, and they are, of the three types of fairies you can play, the most alien on paper. Like, they're described as being the most alien as your mission statement, but the book doesn't always back that up very well. And then the other type, the second type you can play are changelings. Changelings are either humans that were kidnapped by the Firstborn and lived among the Fae and were raised by the Fae, and so soaked up some of that fairy magic and became somewhat fairy themselves, or conversely, they are a Firstborn that was left when a human child was kidnapped and was raised by the humans, and the grandness of their fairiness was reduced by that time with humanity, but they are still fundamentally fairies. The casual term for them in the book is milklings, I think, because they are, of drinking of mother's milk of humans, either before or after they were kidnapped. And then the third type of fairy you play are the Inanimate. These are clearly meant to be kind of like Changeling and Inanimate, but they're really not. They are physical, they are made of some element, and unlike the Firstborn that were made of the mists, just raw, creative, whatever, the Inanimate happened when the mists hit the real world. And the question of the whole myth about how did the real world happen and didn't fairies create it anyway, forget all of that. It's inconsistent on purpose. But when the mists hit the real world, they mixed and mingled and created something else that was a little more concrete. The Inanimate especially piss off the Firstborn because the Inanimate are why the Firstborn can't destroy things. Very light, barely real things, the Firstborn can still unweave, they can unmake. But anything the anime have touched, anything that is really strongly built and of reality cannot be unmade. It can only be reshaped and changed and tweaked. And that's a major point of contention. So that's what you play. Those are the three groups. It then unspools into far more complexity after that.
Yeah, the Firstborn got the PhD in performance, 5-year intensive program. The Changelings got an MFA, but they also got an associate's or a certificate in accounting, which is very useful. To me, the inanime are the people who went to trade school, but they did it to such a level that they will argue with you about like wood grain leeward tree placement theory. They're an almost mystical level of involvement in carpentry or something like that. And this is my arbitrary, nonsensical way of doing it. So we have these 3 types. What do they look like? Can you tell the difference visually?
Yes and no. There's not really a good answer to what they look like. One of the things that this book does is it really heavily emphasizes the what kind of fairy do you want to play? You can play that fairy. Oh, you found a myth about a thing, you can play it. And so you don't get the kind of splats that you get in, Werewolf or Changeling, where it's like, I'm going to play this Pharaoh, I'm going to play this Kith, and you're told this is what it's like. The Firstborn can look like absolutely anything. There is no bound. There's a bound, I would say, in scale and power. You're not going to walk across the world as a god, but anything that is roughly at PC size and scale and scope, if you can imagine it, you can be it. It's actually part of the character creation system. You have something called features when you build your character, and you get at least one greater feature. And the greater feature has some actual mechanical benefit, but then you can take lesser features that are about style and aesthetic and story, and you can kind of go wild with the lesser features. They're there to encourage you to make whatever myth you want to make. The Changelings are much less dramatic, but you do still get features. You do still get to basically pick the myth that was the fairy that either adopted you and imprinted on you, or you were before the humans diminished you. There really aren't any bounds on that. The inanime are a little more defined because they have to be inspired out of some physical thing. You're going to be a dryad or a gust of wind. I love the inanime in here that are wind-based. I love the Pasamirs in Changeling as well. It's just fun to think about how that would work. But even then, they're not nearly as bounded as they are in contemporary. It is meant to be much more open and creative. So can you tell them apart? Yeah, you could probably look at a Changeling and just be like, you're not that dramatic. Like, I can see the myth, and that myth could be anything, but I can see the human. It's only halfway. Do I know you're a Firstborn? Well, at a certain level of power and grandeur, and you're not a tree, yes, I know you're a Firstborn, but beyond that, it's anybody's guess, And similarly with the inanime, like, I can tell you are a thing of the natural world. You're not meat. You are shifting sand. You're a gust of wind. You're 7 notes of music. So I can tell you're inanime, but probably not going to get much further than that.
I really like one of the things about an anime is it's not just the classic elements. As Victor mentioned, it can be any sort of embodiment of that, as you mentioned, music. The Changeling could appear in beautiful carven granite sculpture with little wisps of smells like cinnamon, where the Firstborn just looks like a shape-shifting wall of gemstones that always smells like a Gautier perfume ad or something like that. You're like, a little more of a penchant for the dramatic, not really the Pete Buttigieg type. That's good to know. So you mentioned that there are additional axes of character creation, and frequently in a game, you're like, oh, I'm a Ventru. What else are you? I'm a Ventru. But This seemed like a precursor to a lot of the Chronicle of Darkness games in that you pick kind of other axes that your character is going to clearly come down on. What are they?
Big one is the court. I would say there are really 2 that kind of matter, but one of them only barely matters. I think most characters probably wouldn't pick the second one. The court you have to pick, and there are 4/5 courts. So as with most World of Darkness games, you have a caitiff orphan stand-in, although that stand-in is much more important and meaningful. It has a lot of narrative weight in this case. The four courts, similar to Changeling the Lost, I think this is where the Changeling the Lost structure was roughly taken from. They didn't duplicate it, but they took a couple light things that worked, are the seasonal courts. And you get spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And what's interesting about these is they really closely map to the two courts in modern, but not just the two courts in modern, the dual interpretations of the two courts in modern, because the two courts in modern Changeling each have two different interpretations. There's sort of this seed that like maybe there just wasn't enough magic to maintain four courts anymore. And so you have the spring court, which is all about change and shift and adjustment. It's very, very dynamic. You have the summer court, which is all about tradition and structure. And spring is very much about new growth and beginnings and developing things. And summer is about the way things are supposed to be. And these are very much like Seelie. And it's like, oh, are you the common Seelie or are you these like high Arcadian crazy Seelie? And then the other two courts you get are autumn. And autumn is the court that's kind of open to humanity. And autumn is interested in what's going on with humanity and engaged with all those politics. And then winter is nightmares. Winter is we hunt humanity. We're connected to them in that we depend on them for food, but we are the horrible, awful things that hide in the darkness between the trees and the forest and the places you can't see. And that's very much a division that you saw in the Unseelie in modern. And so you don't have any of the concepts from the contemporary gamer mentioned in here. And in that respect, it's very different from Mage, Werewolf, or Vampire, where even Mage, where it's totally different magic, you have some of the same groups. There's a really clear line you can draw. In this game, if you do want to connect it, you know, even in Mage, you might be like, well, we're in the modern world. We want to have some aspects of modern Changeling as well. You really have to dig. All the links are here, but they are all hidden intentionally. And then I mentioned the fifth group is the Solstice, and the Solstice are the Fae who are not sained to a court. So that's the other thing that's a little different about this is in the other World of Darkness games, like I'm a Ventru. Well, why are you a Ventru? Because my daddy was a Ventru. And in this, it comes down to your name. Saning is a very big thing among the Fae. And before you are saned, you are unshaped. You are unstable. You can't maintain an oath. You can't do any of the things that you kind of think of as a fairy really doing stably. But you are quite the font of uncontrolled power. And there's even a whole plot in here about the Solstice Fae after the War of the Seasons, this war that the Fae are going through is over, they will have no hold on the human world. And it's just like this little like, oh yeah, what happened to the true Fae? Well, the ones that insisted on remaining true and not diminishing themselves with like affiliation and name, these are the Solstice Fae, and here they are. But they don't look at all like you're told they look like anywhere else in the World of Darkness. So that's the kind of one affiliation, and any new Fae can just be named into one of these groups. So you pick it like you'd pick a tradition, but once you've picked it, it is as set in stone as the Ventru thing is. It's like on one hand, it's arbitrary. On the other hand, it's immutable once it's there because of the nature of saning and naming.
Yeah, you can change your tradition in Mage. You can't change your affinity sphere.
Yeah.
To me, it kind of felt more like the Watchtowers from Awakening, that there is a thing that you are drawn to, that once it is there, it is written upon you. And you kind of mentioned this thing, the War of the Seasons. One of the things I think this game gives us is a pretty interesting prehistory that is not necessarily presented in the same mythic tone as some of the other games are. But like, as Victor said, you have the firstborn emerge from the primordial mists, which Victor interprets as quintessence. I interpret it kind of as something else, an unformedness that quintessence would be like. This does create an interesting question. Oh, we go out into the radiance and suddenly we find this primordial lump of quintessence and we get the firstborn for a while. Someone on the mortal sphere finally opens up a bridge to the radiance or the flux, And now the Firstborn can exist again. We have our first embodiments of the primordial mist large enough that they can pop out. And boy, howdy, will that confuse the Boggans. Just putting that out there. So the Firstborns step out of this mist. They create things. The things gain spirit when there's enough of them in one place. I also like the idea that maybe an anime exists somewhere out in one of the Shard realms or on another planet. There are other places that are so untouched by human belief that they can still form under other suns or something like that. The anime are ultimately what kind of set the forces of nature going. I kind of like the way they kind of go like, right, things are a little bit too chaotic. This direction's going to be down. Rain's going to come from the sky. Lightning's periodically going to blast you. Fire hurts. Water's good for you, but don't get too much of it or you're going to have to pee a lot or you might drown. Everyone agreed? Agreed. And it's just this group of elementals that kind of set the laws of physics. Like, all right, let's put it up to vote. All in favor? Aye. Aye. All opposed? Good. Motion carries. So I don't know why they have bad Australian and British accents, but that's the anime in my head. Then the Firstborn are like, no. And they attempt something called the Great Unleashing, where they try and restart the world. And that doesn't work. And they create the biggest oopsie of all. They accidentally create life. And all the courts are like, oh, we did an oopsie.
Yep.
Yep. And the Fae explore life, and they're like, the rules the anime put down, going to be kind of useful. We should follow them. And then the Fae are like, this synchronizing everything was really hard without a way of expressing ideas and concepts with each other in a clear, concise, and extensible way. Let's invent language. And they do. And you have the Spring Court that has this tonal language, the Autumn Court that talks in whispers and hand signals, the Winter Court, which communicates in animal noises, and Summer, which is a very wordy stream with hundreds of letters. I like this as an idea because this is a kooky thing that mages can run into. You're in the Verbena seasonal realms and you go for a hike and suddenly you see this tablet on it with what appears to be hundreds of letters. Not hundreds of symbols, not hundreds of glyphs, hundreds of letters. This is not a syllabary. And then the Fire Fae look at the humans and are like, those guys, we're going to be friends. So Eve is a Firstborn, mates with Adam, which they don't really talk about what Adam was, and has several kids. The Changelings are disappointed as they're inherently physical. They're treated as second-class citizens and so on. And everyone is unhappy. They don't realize how nice they have things, and this is how it always works out. This big war breaks out over what to do with who's going to control what and what the role of the humans are. Winter wants to kill them. Spring doesn't really is like humans are natural. We don't care. Summer is like, we need to give them strict rules. And Autumn is like, let's see what they do. They see the baby walking towards the outlet with the fork. And they're like, I don't know. Let's let them see how this goes. Maybe scars are learning here, kids. And then the spring does this great unleashing that turns the world into the Springlands. And then each other season kind of gathers power and does it in succession. And the thing I like about this is for a brief period of time, the earth is ruled by each of the courts. But we don't know if each reign lasted thousands of years and Winter Court's reign was the Ice Age, or Summer Court's reign was the Hadean era or something like that, or did this happen in 4 successive very strange nights? I think both answers are kind of cool, and I think both can be true. So this War of the Seasons starts, and then there's this mother of all battles, and a whole bunch of the leaders of the courts die, and they're like, you know what? Let us cool our collective dicks briefly. And they take a chill pill. And when they emerge from their time, because Fae have a real weird relationship with time, they come back and they go, ooh, things are different. And our piece is about to end specifically in 1230.
Well, and the other big piece about the coming back is when the Fae left, the Fae had ruled everything. Again, this is their view of history as Mage players, because this is a Mage podcast. None of this needs to be true. But in their view, they ruled everything. They had all of this power, and they had this period where they were trading who was in charge of the world between the courts. It's a familiar story, very different time scale than we were told about previously. And then they went, okay. Let's make some oaths with these humans and put them in charge for a while. They'll be under oath. They'll have to do things well. It'll be fine. We'll give them the power to weave. So even after the fire in anime basically screw the pooch by giving the humans fire, the firstborn are like, we'll do that times 10,000 and it'll be fine.
What could possibly go wrong?
What could go wrong? And then they run off to do their little War of the Seasons for, the book says 800-ish years, bit of a like sundering timeline implied here, but really, who knows? Like, who knows what's really going on there? And then they come back, and what's happened is the humans were very good with that weaving they taught them.
Too good.
We now get into the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is what mages do. Did we get our power from fairies? Do we feel like that's a real thing? The fairies certainly think so. And now everything is defined. And they did not expect humans to be able to do that. The humans were much better at weaving than fairies are. Fairies are great at myths and creation. But in terms of like, oh, this thing already has a shape, I'm only so good at reweaving it. And humans are just like, iron. I can remake the world with iron. And they do. And yeah, the Fae, when they come back, do not know how to handle that whole mess. That's really the things are different that they're kind of panicking about.
And this creates a great question among the Fae of how do we view humans and what do we view about the war? What is kind of that last axis of character as regards the return of the War of the Seasons?
So the other sort of axis of character that you may or may not delve deeply into is kind of the political breakdown. And the four groups you have are the militants. They want to fight the war again. You get a lot of this with Summer, and you don't get so much of this with Autumn because Autumn is, again, all about humans, and the militants are really, really wrapped up in Fae politics, but they don't like how the war has worked out. How they imagine going back and redoing the 800 years that clearly wrecked everything, I have no idea. I wouldn't say that's ever really well explained, but that's their whole vision. Can't we just like do a redo? Which makes sense because they basically don't experience linear time. None of the firstborn do. So a little bit of that makes sense. Then there are the humanists who want to understand humanity. They want to forge new oaths before it's too late. And the thing that's interesting about this is in the Dark Ages setting, the Fae have lost their ability to forge the greatest of their oaths. Before they left, they forged gold oaths with entire cultures, entire tribes of people. And it was like, well, you're born into this tribe, you're bound to this oath now. Deal. And they can't do that anymore. They've tried since they got back to try to, renegotiate what's going on here, and they cannot do that. So again, we get into, well, we're just going to do this thing, even though the prerequisites for that thing have clearly become impossible, but there's still a whole political organization around it. This is a little bit of a pattern with the Fae. They don't like facing reality. And then you have the truth bearers, and they want an end to the War of the Seasons. To be honest, as I went through this book, they're kind of mentioned the least.
Yeah.
They are a group that exists, I think, because they felt like there had to be a place for people who played that. But when you find like references to the major political groups and how they show up, they don't get a lot of word count. I think they are mentioned in some of the splat write-ups as like, well, we've got a lot of this group and a lot of this group. But in terms of the rest of the backstory and talking about what's the role in the plot that's going on, they don't get mentioned a lot. There are a fair number of them, I think, among the Solstice. The Solstice Fae are more likely to be like, this whole thing is stupid. Can we just not? And then the last group are the Constantinians. They want to learn about religion, which this book also leans very, very heavily into the old myths that Christianity kills fairies, which is a whole like colonialism only entirely within Europe kind of narrative where you have the colonialism of the Romans coming in through the church and previously just the Romans and really kind of taking over other cultures. And the fairies had largely resisted that. And fairy faith had stayed very, very strong in the parts of Europe where it was prevalent until the church came along. And the church was really able to kind of tamp that down. And that is very, very present in this book. The other kind of political axis that I saw a lot in some of the flavor portions of the book is they would talk about traditionalists, which isn't necessarily one of these four factions, but there was kind of a division between traditionalists and humanists. And there was one particular group, the Patron Council, and they They listed traditionalists here, but I saw them mentioned in a couple other parts of the book as well. Patron Council are a group of Fae that basically want to go back to doing what they did before the war. Say the war is stupid. We're never going to achieve total domination. We should go back to trading off power, whatever that looks like now in the post-mythic age. And they have traditionalists and seekers. The seekers are always looking for information. The traditionalists are really about tradition and maintaining what the Fae have always been. And then the Vanguard are looking to end the war, and the austere conclave. The austere conclave is described as using dark methods of assassination and such to accrue peace. These four groups in the Patron Council are interesting because some of them really reflect factions and some of them really kind of reflect courts very strongly. The austere conclave, like, yes, you're in the winter court, we know.
Yeah.
I mean,
tell me you're in the winter court without telling me you're in the winter court.
But as you said, this is kind of the first time they tried this multiple axis thing. And I think you can see the lines of them experimenting, but it also makes it kind of exciting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I immediately want to steal for Mage is if someone doesn't want to have to deal with the baggage of the Ascension War as it's going, one of the things that once somebody said it lives rent-free in my head, what if the Victorian era is where the Ascension War really kicks off? That it's not the reinvention of the technocracy, but it's the founding of the technocracy. And you play that game then, and you have these same groups that say, no, the differences in our worldview can be reconciled. And say, for instance, this occurs because for reasons we don't understand, the Nefandi have grown as a faction and are occupying much more of the time of the Awakened than anyone had before. And you could have a group that's like, nope, we need a grand coalition. Nope, we need to harness the power of each of our individual cultures to do it. Nope, we need to unify under technology. Nope, we need to unify under the church or something like that. And all of these still fit. I also like the idea within the Patron Council that you have the groups that are like, oh, these are the traditionalists. These are the ones that are doing most of the talking and the fighting. You have the seekers who are looking for any edge they can. These are like your library warriors who spend most of their time trying to figure out, we don't know how to make those grand oaths anymore, but the know-how has to be around somewhere. Maybe there is one or two true Fae that still know how to do it, that escaped the War of the Seasons, or are now in the cycle of reincarnation and we just haven't found them yet, or that information is in some weird fairy realm. And this is your Indiana Jones type that kind of does that. And then you have the Vanguard who do the political and diplomatic work. And then finally you have the Austere Council, and there is no Austere Council. I don't know why you would ask what the the Austere Council are doing. I think that's a thing that would also be fun in Mage. I think we need to bring back the traditions having secret police that nobody knows about or something like that. I think it would be fun. I think the Cassarify were one of the most interesting ideas that popped out of Sorcerer's Crusade, and to be like, are they the thought police? No, they are here to advance their version of the Ascension War. And one of the things that's been kicking around is, what does the Cassarify look like if they knew the truth of Chiron Mostai's belief that Ascension and Annihilation were one? And now you have this group that is trying to push back against Ascension as much as humanly possible to save reality. Just putting that one out there, kids. But yeah, just this is a good framework if you want to have an overarching political question in your game, how you can have multiple axes and you want to separate the what do we want to do from the how do we want to do it. And that can create something that is messy and interesting, kind of in an evolving game.
I really like the idea that you'd have multiple axes specifically for Mage, because one of the things I've always struggled with Mage is I want Mage to be messy the way an actual group of people creating complicated politics would be messy. You know, splats make sense in Vampire. It's blood, it defines you, it reshapes you. Same with Werewolf, same with Changelings. You are a story. And then Mage and Wraith, they're just political organizations. And Wraith kind of acknowledges the messiness of that by saying, we've got these organizations and in the canon, no one really respects them. Have a nice day. Good luck. And the problem with that approach is, like, what am I picking when I do character creation and what does it mean? Like, there's no answer to that question. And I feel like there's a way to do that maybe a little less realistically, but, strike the balance between vampire clans and this desire to have something that feels lived in and complicated. And I think this would be a good way to do it. In addition to picking paradigm and picking like a big group affiliation, you also sort of explicitly picked your philosophy on, am I just in this for personal ascension? Am I in this for group ascension? If I'm in it for group ascension, maybe there is some space for collaboration with the technocracy. Maybe, you have the technocracy not as a monolith with a like firmly authoritarian group in it, with a moderate group in it, with a, I'm a technomancer and I'm fully technomantic. Like, I don't want to go work with that mystic. I don't think what they're doing is reasonable. I think they're crazy and there are terrible side effects of what they're doing that they aren't considering. But also, I am not an authoritarian and I want humans to find their own path just based on a different set of principles. And I feel like there are messy things about that and it could be confusing, but I think it could be less confusing than Wraith. And I think it would open up a lot of interesting stories. And I do agree this is a good starting point for that kind of access.
Yeah, I could certainly see it within the disparates of, I think we should join the disparate alliance. I think we should not join the disparate alliance. This is what we should do about the traditions, and this is what we should do about the technocracy, and have that very focused story on the founding of the disparate alliance if you have a game where that hasn't happened yet. And suddenly you can be things like, no, we need to be tightly bound together, but we need to ignore the traditions. No, we need to be a loose alliance, but our true enemy is going to be the technocracy at the end of the day, or something like that. And then you have that, every combination of each. And it's one of those things where you were talking about the, like, do you need more than I'm just Ventru? And then, like, if you're playing that vampire game that is very tied to a place, you don't really need those additional axes to be predefined. But kind of as your game world gets bigger and the questions get bigger, that need for politics and drive kind of increases. But one of the things that's super cool about this game, partially because they're like, guys, you get one book, get everything in it. And they're like, okay, we get some bonkers powers. What's the cool stuff that fairies get to do in this game?
So fairies get to do kind of almost anything. So you have your dominions, which are, I'm going to say loosely, they are the equivalent of like a sphere or a path of gifts or a discipline, but they're really not. The dominions are very broad. They're very, very broad domains. And so they have fixed powers in them, and they kind of correlate to the seasons in that there are 4 of them. So you have day, night, dawn, and dusk. And they have very broad kind of areas that they govern. And so you have day where you get warmth and light and heat. You get kind of mind control in their leadership.
I love that the Dark Ages games are like, no, leadership is a distinct thing. I love that the pillar of the chieftain among the spirit talkers or whatever, or the old faith, can detect leadership. You're in charge. You're like, you're a top. Like, I just like the fact that that's an ability that you could have. You're like, I'm going to roll detect Dom. But yeah, and you're like, I don't know why mind control is a day thing, but they're just like, well, fire's nice and brightness, but let's...
Yeah, a lot of these don't necessarily make sense. It's like we have 4 buckets and we need to get all the things in the 4 buckets. And so we're going to put it there.
The control over nature and so on. Like day, you get control over, it is livestock and fruit-bearing trees. Night gives you like dark-loving animals. Dawn is herbivores and those that are crepuscular. And dusk gives you plants with thorns or very sticky sap. And I'm like, yes, I can control roses and the maple syrup industry.
Yeah, or like the dead. Yeah, the dead fall into dusk. They're just, why aren't they night? I don't know. Dusk is atmospheric for the dead, but night has nightmares and despair. Some of it's a little arbitrary, and I think it's because, again, they had to get everything in relatively small word count. So you get levels in a dominion, and that defines a dice pool. And then you get powers based on those levels. You can go and you can pick individual powers. And in this respect, they're a little more like gifts than anything else in that they're all kind of fairly arbitrary. There isn't necessarily a progression. So that's the part that's a little more like other World of Darkness games. The one thing I would say about this is there's definitely kind of a cap on how far can I progress? This is not a game that you're going to play this character for 4 years. You will run out of things to spend experience on. That was the one thing that always stood out to me about this game is it's clearly not meant for super long form games. But I don't know that anyone's ever even tried to, I'm sure someone's tried to long form Dark Ages Fae, but it would be a big challenge. The other big thing you get with the Dominions is the ability to unleash. And anyone who's played modern Changeling knows kind of what unleashing is. It came from Dark Ages Fae. It's a very different thing in Dark Ages Fae. It doesn't have the sort of negative connotations. And it's when you just summon up the mists and just unleash them. So you as a fairy are a container and you sort of contain the mists and give them shape. It's described at a few points in the book that you withhold these primordial forces. And unleashing is when you go, well, I'm not going to withhold them anymore.
Yep.
I'm just going to like pick a mood. The whole idea of like from Peter Pan, where Tinkerbell, well, you see, fairies are very small. They're only big enough to have one emotion at a time. You're like, I'm going to pick the thing I am right now. I'm going to be that thing absolutely 110%. And then I'm just going to stop holding back the forces of creation. Good luck. I mean, that's literally what you're doing. It's very uncontrolled. It's very wackadoo. It can go very wrong. Maybe you don't care if it goes wrong, though. Like, the Fae have weird motivations. The thing I love about it, that's only true in Dark Ages Fae, it's how you learn new controlled powers. So you can be like, well, I don't know how to mind control, but I'm going to unleash a command. And okay, that worked. Well, I'm going to unleash a command again. And once I've unleashed a command on someone enough times, then I can kind of see how it works and I can do it in a less risky manner. And I love that idea that you are just constantly kind of experimenting and prototyping on how to manipulate the world in the least ethical, safe way possible.
I mean, that's how chemistry worked for a while. We were like,
yeah,
what if we just put everything in an acid? Oh, that's kind of thing. What if we just electrify everything? What if we put it all in a vacuum? And fairies right there. Take that, Sir Humphrey Davy. My fastest way of describing it is like, what if Paradox got its own dice pool? And every magical effect was an opposed roll with reality. So mechanically, when you unleash, you roll your miss plus dominion and you roll your unleashing dice at the same time. And you can get enough successes for the effect to happen and get more successes than the unleashing pool, in which case you more or less get to pick what happens. You can have enough successes and not enough to overcome the unleashing pool, in which case some kind of kooky happens. You can have a flat out failure where you don't really get enough successes on each, or you can just get the weird stuff happening where you're like, okay, I have a big plan. I'm going to do it. All the cows are walking upright. Was that part of your plan? And then you're like, no, but now it is. So let's see if I can roll with this. Also, none of us have pants anymore. And that is unleashing. And it's a neat way to do it. I'd like to see someone come up with a version of Mage where you have a few more graduations in terms of Paradox, and you're like, okay, you're trying to do a lot more people. We add one more to the Paradox pool. We're going to roll both of them. And now you can have messy successes and terrible failures and so on. And I just like the fact that the storyteller gets to roll against you, because if there's anything we need, it's a way to make the games more adversarial.
Yeah, the other thing that's really interesting about the powers is you have 2 power stats. You have your mists, which is what gets pulled in for unleashing, and then you have weaving. And mists is how much raw power do I have access to, and weaving is how good am I at making it do controlled, specific, very structured things. And you can get terribly out of balance. You can reach the point where you can't unleash anymore because you've just invested too much in giving things shape and form and structure. Or you can lose the ability to use your controlled powers because you've kind of given up on weaving and you just become an agent of chaos. There's a whole like keeping your balance dynamic, which I feel like was this game's answer to banality, and it's infinitely better than any system they've ever had for banality. Like, it's just far more interesting. There's way more flavor, but I like that idea that you can trap yourself in a form, which is just a horrible way to be as a changeling. And that part of your power is this like very controlled, structured thing. And there are rules in here for fairy domains. and like the spaces and what we would think of in contemporary Changeling as freeholds. And you can have a weaving freehold. You can have a freehold that is just about giving you the power to control structure, which is the total
It's a wood
antithesis
shop,
of
okay?
anything.
It's just
Yeah,
going to
well,
be
yeah,
a wood
it's
shop.
a wood shop. But it's totally the opposite of anything you could think of as like a freehold that's ever been described anywhere else.
Tech school
And I
for
like,
firstborn.
yeah, I love that this book just opens a couple of those doors and said, look, a system for a thing that clearly needs massive explanation, but we don't have word count, so you get 3 sentences. Good luck.
Yeah.
I mean,
it is
that's weaving freeholds.
It's learning how to skydive with your instructor's boot on the back of your parachute. And
yes.
good luck with that. It creates kind of unique counter magic where one of the benefits of that unleashing thing is it's hard to stop. If a pipe bursts in my house, that's comparatively easy to shut off the water. If a dam bursts, not so much, or torrential rain. And I think that's kind of neat. Do you think Mage should have an unleashing system? Should you just be able to hit the forces button and your avatar gets to go whee for a moment, and you get your point of quiet, you get your point of resonance. You don't get any paradox from it because the avatar takes care of all that, but you're not really sure how it turns out.
I don't know. I feel like that would be a great system, but maybe not on the mud ball. I would love that to be available if you start getting into spiritual spaces. I think that makes sense. Why wouldn't a mage be able to do that? Why wouldn't a mage be able to just like direct their will in arbitrary ways? But I feel like the themes of Mage, the idea of Mage and reality fighting back, and the way humans work, I feel like Unleashing is meant to draw a stark contrast with the way humans do magic. It's supposed to be something that is dangerous and scary and unnatural. So I don't know how I feel about giving that to humans, even, the supernaturally impossibly talented humans.
I do it, but I would want something where it's like, no, it's going to cost you 8 quintessence, and you're going to get a permanent point of quiet out of it. So you can do it.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Yeah. And then suddenly you get Marauders out of the other end of it, where they do that last unleashing for that last great, and now they're an NPC. The more time I spend staring at it, I think the quiet and the resonance system are the 2 underdeveloped systems to me really in Mage that you can do some really cool stuff with. And I'm very curious to see if we wind up getting anything in M5, but probably not because we can't have nice things.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the need to have an equivalent to Hunger Dice could do some really interesting things with Resonance. I know everyone's like Paradox Dice.
No.
That is the obvious choice.
Yeah,
I would love Resonance Dice.
Yes.
Okay, how much magic are you going to throw around and how frequently? Because it's going to make you real weird. And I would like that. And I would like it. What I would love, because in previous editions of Mage and even M20, you get this thing where you have a paradox effect, something wacky happens. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense for like the thing that's trying to protect reality. What I would prefer is you're too fast and loose with your magic. It's really impacting your pattern. Look at all this resonance. Oh, and Paradox is going to fight back against the resonance in addition to your intentional effects. And you're now very visible to it. And so you've got enough resonance. So maybe Paradox happens when you take non-magical actions. I would prefer something more like that. It would feel more thematic to me.
That was that kind of the key difference to me is Paradox is not present at every moment in the way that resonance is. I'm with you. I would be curious to see that, especially if it were one of those things where you accrue dark resonance, where it's something that you can't suppress. It's arcane you can't turn off. It's the magic that's worked its way into your pattern, which seems good at the time, but maybe not. So what you mentioned this Mist and Weaving, what fuels their powers? Is there fairy quintessence? And is that something that mages are going to care about?
I mean, they have mists. Mists and weaving are both stats that you can develop. They are spendable points. And so you can very easily take kind of the mage default that any point that can be spent by any other supernatural is just a point of quintessence with a very strong resonance. It's kind of the baseline. How do you treat these things in mage? I think the interesting thing about mists and weaving specifically is they would have very strong resonance. It's not like Vitae that's like a little icky and a little predatory, or Gnosis that's like very much of the earth. Rage would be intense. Weaving and mists are interestingly like they're associated with the two opposite ends of the essence poles in Mage, because you've got like these two poles with your essence. You've got dynamic and pattern, and then you've got questing and primordial. So you have like Mist is very much dynamic. Mist is weird. It's all of the possibilities in the broadest sense, which if you get down to how quintessence was originally described, is like quintessence is just the unshaped potential for reality to exist. On one hand, that reads like Mists, but the way quintessence works in Mage is much more controlled and subdued, and Mists is very wild. So to me, Mists is almost like if you took primordial and dynamic and shoved them together and like be both of these things all the time as much as you can, that's kind of Mists. And in a way, weaving is if you take pattern and questing, and it's like you are driven to create, because the Fae are overwhelmingly driven to create, but this is the act of giving form. This is the act of defining. So in that respect, it's very pattern, but like it's this driven, needful thing. And in that respect, it's very questing. Whereas in Mage, pure pattern is like stasis is fine. We don't need to ever change anything ever again. And weaving is definitely not that. And so it's interesting. I feel like it's almost a collapsing of the four major poles in Mage into a two-pole kind of system.
I like the idea also that mages could access this, but it's something that if you mark it on your character sheet, you use maybe a different color mechanical pencil or something like that.
Yeah.
And you're like, you have 4 points of mists in you. It's 2 a.m. You can't sleep. You have some collage work to do. And maybe it's something that doesn't influence the mage, but it influences their avatar. It's the equivalent of giving them a pixie stick or something like that. And that mages have access to it. And suddenly they realize, oh, this isn't just quintessence, or this isn't just quintessence with resonance. Because normally quintessence doesn't do anything if you have a bunch of it in your pattern. And the whole idea behind TAS is it is formed and externalized. Even if it has a resonance, you don't feel that until you're using it, or you only do lightly in whatever stored form it is. But I like the idea that mages could pick up this and you're like, you have a lot of weaving. Your master's thesis should really be finished now. And we mean now. And you've fewer than 130 footnotes. Do you really know what you're talking about? Or something like that. And I kind of like the idea of that being kicked around and causing compulsions. Or a group inadvertently builds a chantry on top of essentially a freehold of this stuff, thinking that it is just another node. And little did they know. Or something like that.
I mean, it's funny because that's kind of how I run quintessence already. Now, most of the quintessence that I have my mages find, especially if it's quintessence from like their chantry, it's not like that. Whenever mages in my game are like, I want to rip apart this wonder, or I want to grab the free quintessence from this freehold, or, oh, look, there are werewolves out there. I bet they have a center of power I want to go claim. I always treat that quintessence as doing what you just described in something that will be thematic given where they took it from.
Yeah, you take something from a Garrow Cairn, everyone gets chest hair. Doesn't matter, just everyone does.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had a player once who like realized vampires were walking quintessence like Slurpees, and they were like, you mean I could just, and I'm like, look, buddy, this is the consequences door. I'm not gonna yes, you can.
The usage of the word
but
just
don't.
seems
yes, just is maybe an inappropriate description of what will happen if you do. You have 4th level prime, and do you feel comfortable, doing the vulgar magic to remove this like structural real part of magic that exists in the world? Because I'm going to make that vulgar. Go for it. Yeah, I will let mages do anything, but
you're not
sometimes you just have to make it expensive.
You're repatriating human life essence.
Exactly.
You're decolonizing the Ventru.
Yeah, but if you do it without 4th level prime, you're going to regret.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we burned down the museum. We are still in the museum. We should have thought of that first. Yes, in one very real way, you have liberated the Rosetta Stone, but it's very heavy and the building is on fire, so good luck with that. So we've talked about a bunch of the things they can do, and you've talked about the political angle, and I guess the last thing we have to talk about are kind of these oaths. And the thing I love about the oaths, mechanically, the big thing they grant you is the ability to resist echoes. So the idea is Fae are creatures of myth and legend, and they have accumulated vulnerabilities due to culture or due to their fairy mistborn nature, and oaths protect them from this. So the world is presented as very dangerous for fairies. Like, they are lethal to other night folk, but they are obliterated frequently by mortals, which is such a delightful inversion of every other game where it's like, no, no, no. The Garrow I can deal with. The housewife that is always making the sign of the cross, though, scares my pants off. That's going to be tough. The little kid that always says his prayer before bedtime, that's the little old lady across the street that leaves me cream. She's cool in my book. But what are those oaths, and why do you think they are so important in the game? Like, what is the unique angle of them?
So I think that in this game, oaths are the primary mechanism to connect this game to Changeling the Dreaming. I know we're mostly focusing on Mage here, but oaths are the thing that makes this game function like Changeling. One thing that gets said a lot is, oh, Dark Ages Fae is much more like Changeling the Lost. And aesthetically it is. You've got the Four Seasons, you've got a darker tone. There isn't the emphasis on cute things and writing poetry and, getting glamour from a paintbrush. But at the end of the day, the opening story in this book is all about a changeling, and a very important changeling, a very important firstborn. And some of the characters in the story did not want that firstborn to be given over to humans for political reasons. And it's like, well, when we hit this point, when they age to this point, we're going to reclaim them and we're going to bring them into our court and we're going to sane them. And then the church comes in and they specifically pick a house that's following the old oaths. They're leaving out the cream. They're, clearly practicing fairy worship. And so they thought that would be a safe place to do this. And then the church comes in and they go in and they're like, oh, we have to save her. But by the time they get to her, they can't touch her because she's been baptized and she's no longer a changeling and she thinks they're monsters. And they do look a bit more like monsters because they are true fae and they are alien. But it's a really heartbreaking story. And it makes it very, very clear normalcy is still the bad guy. Normalcy is bad in this game. So in that respect, this is part of dreaming. Like, this is still part of that classic world of darkness.
The thing I love about it, though, is if you ever look through like the original D&D spellbook, there was always like the third level spell that would be like grow wheat. And you're like, I'm not going to get grow wheat. I'm going to get fireball. Because fireball is cool. And you're like, well, I'm a plantomancer and I worship rice or something like that. But because of the oaths and their importance in protecting you from echoes, like if they leave out the cream, you have to make the crop good.
Yes.
And the fact that it was a late spring, you need to bring in your fairy magic to make that turd crop come in, or this family of turd farmers you're going to be held responsible by the oaths that you didn't make it a good harvest. So suddenly the fact that you have a 5-dot artifact you've got the sword of decapitation and the shield of you can't touch me, bitch. The fact that you didn't make the crop come in is going to force you to take aggravated damage until you do. And I love that because suddenly you care about the fact that you're like, oh, you're good with dusk. You have the ability to control mammals that have the ability to clap or something like that, or whatever stupid way it has of broken up. Like, oh, you're capable of controlling fur-bearing animals, so we're going to need that to help them get through this harsh winter. And then it becomes a mage game because you have to argue with the stole or the stoat or the mink or something to be like, no, I know we're friends, but I have this oath to uphold. And you're like, do you need to kill me? Kinda. Shit writes itself, but it gives you a reason to use all those weird powers. And I love that.
Yeah, I love it to death. And I love the fact that the forgetting is kind of seated in that, oh, we have these gold oaths with whole communities and they kind of fell apart, but the humans still kept their benefit end of it. Like, did we not uphold it? No, we must have upheld it, but like no one remembers what the oaths were.
And humans can accidentally uphold it. So if one of the oaths is keep this forest sacred and do not touch it, the Black Plague came through. Everyone's dead. No one's touched it. No one actively, there isn't the old wise woman that says, don't go play in the forest anymore. Humans have accidentally upheld it. And now the Fae have to do their part of it. And they're not sure what.
And that's where the echoes come from. And I think that's really interesting. I also kind of interpret all of the church bits, all of the echoes that are tied to the church, as being a second class of echo. So echoes can be, I made an oath with you, I will do this, you will get this, and if I break the oath, may I be struck down by XYZ. Well, you messed up and you broke the oath, so now I can, throw iron at you and it's gonna wreck you. There's a little sidebar in here about more or less the fairies think that the cold iron thing is the result of breaking a particularly large oath, but no one remembers. There's like a myth about it. Most fae don't believe that myth, but they do think it's the result of breaking an oath. And so there's that. I kind of think what happened with the church and all of these random echoes that are all tied with the church, this is a very fair, like, fae take on it, where I'm accepting the fae part, like, story is real, is we did the gold oaths. We said, you can remake reality. Great. And the humans did. And that means they can make up echoes. I think the fae just gave humans the ability to wreck them. And that's the kind, like, not thinking about consequences is a very, like, it's very on brand for the fae. So, and that would explain where some of these other random echoes are coming from. Now, thinking about that from a mage standpoint, no, we did not get the ability to weave reality from the fairies. Like, no mage is ever going to admit that. And I don't think treating that as true if the game you're running as mage makes sense. But man, it's interesting if you want to run a truly, like, mixed, we don't know who's right Dark Ages Fae mixed game, and you've got Dark Ages Fae players.
I think we've gone over most of the bits about fairies and the world and the cosmology. How do we use them in the games? In a contemporary game, where do you see the true fae coming from? Do you see it as a thing where they're always there and they just replace changelings, that they live alongside them and they're kind of the awkward cousins? Some event occurs and they come back. How do we get these fae into the modern world?
I think of the three options you just listed, 1 and 3 are viable. I don't see how these fae could exist alongside changelings.
Yeah.
Not for very long. Like, maybe there would be some horrible event, kind of like the Nefandi end time sort of scenarios where we're going to tear down the walls that make reality stable. In that end times game, very briefly, these two groups might exist besides each other, but it wouldn't last for very long. Yeah. If you're going for something a little more stable, I think we're not going to do changelings. We're just, the fae are still around. I think you could do that. I think the thing you have to grapple with there is, if you accept Mage's premise about reality zones and paradox and allowable things, the fae all fall solidly into bygone territory. They fall into, okay, now how am I justifying them bypassing paradox? Because changelings, the thing that we're getting rid of in this scenario, all of their weaknesses from a mage point of view, like, oh, that's just how paradox deals with this supernatural. They don't have true magic, they have more defined magic, so paradox kind of settles into a pattern as well. And so the mists and banality, that's paradox. And that's how mages would view that. So while echoes exist, echoes are not strong enough to maintain the kind of normalcy that, like, the out of the book mage setting requires, And so I think that's the thing you have to grapple with in that scenario. I think there are ways of doing that. I think you could have a masquerade kind of situation. You could look at the echoes and tweak them slightly and say, all right, we're going to introduce a couple things, maybe add a few more dominion powers around hiding and make them much easier, maybe build in some default abilities, but not go so far as to recreate changelings. I think you could tweak them and it would work. The biggest challenge with that approach is most of the flavor text in this book is very deeply rooted in this one specific medieval moment where they know in 2030 their negotiated peace is over. They've seen it because they don't experience time in a linear fashion, but they don't know how it's going to happen. It's this very weird moment for them. We're like, we don't experience time, so we can see all into the future. We can't see past this date. We can see the very beginning of the action, so we know it's the end of the piece. We have no idea what happens afterward, what's going on. It kind of reads as, welcome to the shattering, buddy. The date is not right for the shattering, though, which is also interesting. It's off by a whole century. But, like, their whole conundrum is rooted in this war that wouldn't work in a modern setting. All of their opinions are rooted in the culture of the medieval church, which doesn't make sense in a modern setting. So, I mean, I think if you were to just take them as a supernatural, you could do that. you'd have to rewrite the rest of the game.
Yeah, I do think you can kind of have this interesting angle where they could be returning because of the fall of traditional religiosity. Now that the nuns are the largest group, the pagans aren't there. It would require significant work, but now we have this new kind of true fae that are aligned with seasons, but their goal is to almost create conspiracies with mortals, and QAnon is the winter or dusk conspiracy that is out there, and each of them kind of aligns themselves with some sort of social movement to kind of create the oaths and contracts. And January 6th was suddenly just the fulfillment of one of the contracts that they had made with mortals, that we will provide you with the tools, the organizational power, and the stealth to do this, and in exchange you need to create this great commotion or something like that. Even if you don't take it directly, I think the idea of, I like the true fae kind of as an alternative to just demons as a thing to make two-sided bargains with. And now they are taking advantage of this almost second shattering where we start living in our own little reality bubbles again. And they're like, oh, this isn't large and unified enough to create the echoes that would kill me. We can start tiptoeing out into the modern world by taking these weird, iconic archetypal forms and going through the media and seeing, what are the current forms? What are the current fairy myths? Is the deep state a fairy myth, essentially? But I like the idea of fairies taking advantage of current political schisms to essentially create oaths and saying, well, if you don't yell at people on the internet for 2 hours a day to generate the rage that allows me to exist, I am not going to do my side of the bargain in terms of giving you the gold that you need so that you don't have to have a normal job, or that I give you health care in exchange for it because you don't have a job that covers it. I think there's kind of another way to take them that is them re-emerging and trying to take advantage of what appears to be a more shattered pagan reality, as it were, this lack of unified worldview, to do something. It is a more supernaturally leaning and less nephondic way of taking it, and I kind of like that, but I would have to do a lot more thinking for it to make sense.
I think the way that would make sense. So I like that. I don't think that works for all four of the courts. That's a really great autumn winter story. And the thing that's interesting about that is the whole like new resurgence, whatever, that's the evanescence. I mean, that in terms of narratively, you've just described the evanescence. And I think what you could do, and this does get us back to a little bit more of these fairies existing alongside the normal changelings in a modern setting, is get rid of the adhene, throw the adhene away, and insert the true fae. And one of the things they talk about that they bring up in Dark Ages Fae, which I love, I wish this was acknowledged more in Changeling, is that to be seen by a human is to be weak against a human. Like if you're hiding in the forest and you use a dominion and you wreck a whole community, as long as they never saw you, you're fine. As soon as they see you and they know what you are, their own like belief and, to use like technomantic mage terms, anthropic effect, immediately assaults you. You immediately experience echoes, and you can develop whole new echoes you never had just by being seen by a human. The adhene in Changeling, they don't fill the particular like media piece of what you described, but they kind of fill that place, re-emerging from the dreaming. And I think if you actually had true fae, like dark true fae, emerge back out in that dark moment and start to do some of the things you're describing, but have to stay very conspiratorial and forcing themselves to stay very, very hidden because they're not protected by the modern day mists, distinct from Dark Ages Fae mists. I think you could tell that story. That would be very different from they're here instead of the changelings. I think in that scenario, the actual changelings, if you did do alongside, they would hate them. I mean, they would be like, no, these things have to be destroyed because more Thalane than Thalane.
I think you could create space for summer and spring if the summer gets a presence of kids rediscovering, American kids not being happy with quote unquote American culture, so they go back to their roots. And rather than it going necessarily this Midsommar direction, you have a whole bunch of Scandinavian kids who are rediscovering all the pre-Christian rituals they did that because they thought it was fun and kooky and not necessarily because it came out of true belief. But to me, the oaths don't care about the why.
Yeah, that's true.
The little old lady who keeps leaving cream out for the neighborhood cat, she's still leaving cream out. The box has been checked. I wonder if that could do it. And then spring comes out of this, new forms of fairy myth are being created and generated as kids are like, well, vampires have been played out, wizards have been played out. And then we have this upwelling of fairy fiction that comes along, and spring looks at it and goes, that's us. Oh, what do your fairies look like? Oh, they come wreathed in the scent of cinnamon, and they are born of beautiful weavings of cardboard refuse. I can do that. And that is their way of stepping back into the world. And it doesn't create a war of the seasons necessarily, but it gets us all four back in kind of a way, if you wanted to.
That is definitely one way to take that. I think if you have autumn and winter leaning into media and leaning into, all of these things that are going on, the obvious move for summer is outright fascism.
Okay.
Summer is all about order and structure. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. Like,
that's fine.
Like, if the obvious move there is, no, clearly the world has descended into chaos. Free will was a mistake. Let's fix this. And then spring would be no, we like change. Like, I could see spring being the good guy court. I think the other three courts would be sort of terrible.
Yeah. And summer's going to be the best dress because that's how it always works. They're going to have amazing graphic design. They're going to have a catchy, it's frustrating.
Yeah. But I mean, in the same way that like the Sealy are kind of fascist too. I mean, it's the thing nobody wants to admit, but like, let's go back to feudalism and have control over everything. Where have I heard that before?
Yeah. Hugo Boss, Sealy.
Yeah, definitely.
So we have explained the angle where the fairies come back. Is there somewhere out in the Umbra where you see people running into this? Like, another thing that's introduced is the idea of fairy places, which I thought were endlessly fascinating. Do you think there's an angle there?
I do. I think there's a great angle there. As part of prepping for this, I went and I looked up a couple threads and discussions about mage players and what they think about some of the mage groups that dealt with fairies, and some discussion about some of the fairy hooks that have been left for Hollow Ones, and then House Marinita, which is the House of Hermes that focused on fairies. It came over from Ars Magica, and it's never really had a moment in the White Wolf canon. It technically exists, but it's never had a moment. It was thrown into Ex Miscellanea very, very quickly. But one of the things that is interesting in the way I've always run things is, okay, you're a mage. You are not automatically immune to the mists at all. If you're enchanted and you experience a bunch of stuff, you're not going to remember it because the mists. However, if you use the mind sphere and observe it using your magic, you're going to remember that. You are observing this thing. You are peeking beyond the veil. Mages are doing that. Mages are very good at doing that. Yeah, absolutely. If you use magic, while you might get some paradox, and I might make some things vulgar because you're exposing some stuff to reality, yes, absolutely, you can bypass it. And everything in modern Changeling is like, you go into the dreaming and it's just more of the same, only extra, except Changelings have to maintain their stories. Part of the thing about treating Dark Ages Fae as the precursor to Changeling is all of the pieces of the modern story are here, and none of them look the way they're described in the modern books. They're all there. And that speaks to the fact that Changelings had to wrap themselves up in human stories, and they can't put those stories down. So when a Slua goes into the deep dreaming, they experience other Slua. That doesn't mean that's what's really there. And a mage who's enchanted will be impacted by the enchantment of the fairy, and maybe they would experience the same thing as the fairy if they were taken into the dreaming. That doesn't mean the mage that's piercing through all that with their spheres isn't going to see the real Fae there. Maybe it's not what the Changelings think it is through their narrative filter that they need to survive. I really like that idea. I think, if mages go wandering into Maya through the force of their own will, this is a great source book for what they might find there.
Yeah, just retitle it The War of the Maya or something like that. And this is suddenly a war that has raged across those dream bubbles upon the etheric ocean, which is mentioned precisely once, but makes everything make sense. And I think the other thing is, if you're playing with the Reckoning metaplot, I like the idea that the true Fae did escape to the Umbra, and the realms that are out there, some of them may have been true Fae realms that the mages kicked out. And now the mages are gone, and the true Fae are back. And your characters are like, well, we're going to take over this realm. Good luck trying. You don't remember the oaths that bind us. You don't know what any of our echoes are. So now they're dealing with this weird mage predator scenario where they have to figure out how to kill this thing with no information on it.
I mean, that's the nice interpretation. That is the very kind take on this, because I mentioned earlier the solstice fae. So the solstice court, where you're not saned. You are literally an unsaned fairy. You are a fairy without a fully defined name. And there are all kinds of disadvantages, but one of the things about them is they cannot make oaths. Well, that's a big disadvantage, but it's also a big advantage, because what happens with the fae is as soon as they're saned into a court, they're bound up in all of the oaths that court was bound into back when there were gold oaths made, because the gold oaths weren't between one fairy and a whole society of humans. They were between the fae. But the solstice fae aren't the fae in strictly named terms. And if you take the little hook they put in here about, oh, well, the unsaned fae won't have a claim on this world once this event happens, then what if the true fae that escaped back were all solstice fae? They sane themselves as something completely different in the Maya, and you're at a blank slate. And oh, all of this like shaping and everything that you thought you could just do, and all the things that you've done against changelings and whatnot, none of it works because there are no oaths defining it. And so if you want to be able to deal with them, you're also going to have to deal with them. And you make the characters engage with oaths with like true fae who maybe have figured out gold oaths again. What happens then? I think that there are hooks here that you could go even much more brutal with, in that we're going to go in the deep places kind of story.
I really like the idea of Dark Ages Fae dealing with modernity. Like, you're used to dealing with these Scandinavian farmers, and that village is gone, and now you have a tie to this primarily Hispanic neighborhood. What is the oath you strike? What does that look like with this creature who has no notion of time is now interfacing with the new culture, that they're like, they see the areas where Christianity picked up weird stuff and they recognize that. And they're like, no, Our Lady of Guadalupe is not Mary. It is all this other things. And they see these little Mayan and Aztec bits and they're like, this I get. And suddenly we have those weird inflections. I just like that idea of, for lack of a better term, contemporary or modern synchronization. Like, what is the oath they do to protect this Taqueria or something like that? And I think that's an interesting game because I'm a fan of urban fantasy and I periodically like weird stuff like that. What is the oath that this fae could swear with these 4 city blocks? What would the people ask for, and what does the fae ask for? And I just like the idea that you're a syndicate member wondering why your ventures aren't quite working out as you think it is, and then you discover an 1100-year-old fairy that survived the War of the Seasons has struck up a agreement with Chinatown, and that's a thing you have to deal with now.
Well, and I love that because that would speak to some of the technocracy's more hardline approaches to certain things. I like the idea that you could have a true fae where if they walk out into the world, just they'll freeze. The winter will get them and they will freeze. They will die unless they can actually get some humans worshiping them again. And that speaks to the whole mage dynamic with reality zones. So maybe there is a true fae and they've struck up an agreement with Chinatown. They've gotten enough of the people in Chinatown to worship them, maybe to honor old oaths. Maybe they make a whole new oath and they're following whole new traditions, but by honoring the oaths, they create a reality zone. And maybe it's just to the fairy, oh, they're following the oaths, this is how it works, it's oaths, it's myths, it's magic. But the technocracy would see it and experience it as anthropic effect, as this is a tiny little reality zone. The belief that is off timeline has gotten so intense that it's now manifesting in ways. And like, maybe there are little schisms where like that zone ends and normalcy begins, where paradox, can be an issue. But if you get that block in, no, this is reality here. And I do think there's a place for that is structured in a way that would speak to Mage's view on things. And I think the Fae and the Oath structure, if you take the loose description of it and how it works, and then think, how can I really make this speak to Mage themes? I think that could be really cool. And it would give them a structure for surviving while still allowing the rest of the World of Darkness and other changelings, etc., if you want to make them part of the game, still function the way they already do.
And kind of the last thing, we've had a pretty wide-ranging conversation, is this introduces the idea in Chapter 5, Kingdoms and Quests, the great places of the courts and the Fey realms, which are just defined enough to do whatever you want and just vague enough to do whatever you want in a way that I really
Yeah.
think they thread the needle. And in the same way that a changeling will be a firstborn or whatever, a fae will be bound by an oath, everyone who enters the place is placed under it. So, for instance, the Grand Bazaar is ruled by Autumn. It seems to be this place that moved around in the time, just kind of Arabia and the Maghreb. And you can find anything you want, and you can trade with gold and silver and gems if you want, but promises are a common currency in addition to the precious metals. And the place itself is under an oath. Anyone who steals something, if they leave it, does not have the usage of their arms for, I think, until a cycle of the moon. Verbal agreements are binding, and no one can do anything that prevents trade. And I like this as an idea for Umbral Realms. Again, if we say that some of the Umbral Realms were taken over from the True Fae by mages, they could still be under these geesh, essentially, these commandments. You have Underbridge, which is controlled by Winter, which is the starless land of eternal night lit by sputtering torches and wasps, that every bridge has the potential to enter into it, and it contains an infinite number of bridges that spans any two locations. So if you know what you're doing, you can use it as a quick transit route. If you don't know what you're doing, you will eventually meet your gruesome end. The Crystal Fortress, which was controlled at least most recently by Summer, which is just full of secrets. Its walls, seemingly of ice, are just covered in strange glyphs somewhere in the high north. It is an area called the Library, which are just covered in shifting etchings. We get one that's under the sea, and then we get the Fading Realms, which are seemingly gone. And I think all of these are pretty neat, and some of these are implied as being absorbed into world belief, that the Lost Forge was the place where Triton's Trident and Ares' Chariot were made, and that these devil coins float around, that if you spend them at night or find it at night, it will take you to a realm of coins where a strange creature will come eat you atop its pile of gold. I thought these were pretty evocative. I thought they were cool.
Oh yeah, they're fantastic. I love the fairy realms in here, and I like this approach to fairy realms a lot more than the dreaming. The dreaming is honestly like kind of inaccessible and weird.
And
I
you don't
like
get a
the
lot of
idea.
reasons to go there, and that's
You
the thing
don't.
yeah.
I mean, these places, I would say they are more similar to the way, in terms of their function in the game, they're more similar to freeholds. But if you think about the way they would behave in a modern setting and the way mages would interact with them, the thing that stands out to me is the book makes very clear that these are not separate spiritual places. This isn't like the Gauntlet. You can just, as a mortal, you can just wander into one. And in a lot of cases, you have to go at like the exact moment of equinox when, the moon shines through the preordained hole, or, all kinds of random things that have to align in order for the door to open. But you do not need to be magical if you happen to be at the right place at the right time to walk through that door. And the thing that I remember talking with Simon a lot about is the idea that the whole like flat earth, round earth thing, the earth becoming round, which in mage terms, it became round, was closing all the gates. Before, if you wandered off long enough, sooner or later, you would end up out of the world. And then the technocracy went, oh, that's not okay. That's horrible. Like, that's dangerous and terrible, and there are awful things that live there, and we don't want to feed them. And they closed all the gates, and when the last gate closed, the world became round, and you could walk all the way around it and get back to where you were. And what happens if those doors start opening again? What happens if, like, the working that makes the world round becomes unstable? I mean, yeah, the technocracy would freak out, but let's even take them out of it. Like, what does it mean to live in that world? I kind of like leaving that question hanging in a mage game. So yeah, that was a lot of what I thought about. You could also go a much simpler route and just like reopen a couple doors and take more of the Hellboy approach, because Hellboy definitely has this kind of, oh, we're going to find these places and go into where the Golden Army is. And I still think that would be really fascinating, especially if it was, oh my God, my mother, my brother, my sister, the mortals in my life that I care about, mortals, I'm thinking Too Fairy here, the sleepers in my life that I care about, wandered into spirit. How did that happen? That's not supposed to be possible. And then you find yourself in one of these places and have to save them. I think there are a lot of really interesting stories you could tell with that.
And with that, anything else you have to say about Dark Ages Fae?
It's a great game and you should play it. I would love to play this game. It's a game I've read a lot and I've adapted for other games. I've never found someone willing to run it for me or players quite brave enough to tackle it. But it's such a fun game. It's so evocative. I know there are a couple pretty solid Dark Ages Fey Storyteller Vault texts out there, one by Charlie Cantrell, the exact name of which is eluding me, but it's really nicely
past his prologue.
I think it might be past his prologue. There's a lot of cool stuff in there, and there's a lot of cool white space, a lot of ideas where they went, we're going to open up this white space. We don't have the word count to define it, but, go nuts. If you like that kind of World of Darkness play, this is the book for you.
Yeah. Victor, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As always, it was a blast.
Do you have anything to shout out? I don't know. I guess I could.
No, I don't have any particular shout outs right now.
Okay. Awesome. That one just kind of ended. Well, thank you. That was done, and this justified me having read all of Dark Ages Fey. Maybe when we're old and crotchety and we just run Mage and Dark Ages Fey at Gen Con, and we're just the two grumpy old people who are like, I don't know what kids are doing with all these 4-sided and 6-sided dice. In my day, you just needed one, and it had 10 on it. Or
10,
like that.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the even older, crankier D&D players are like, "What?"
Yeah, us going over and kicking over their walkers and running back to our tables. And they're like, "You kids with your polycules and your D10s and your narrative systems, we didn't need that in our day." So,
this sounds like a quality Gen Con to me.
Yes. Gen Con 2069. I'm ready for it.
Oh my God. Noise.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. This has been Mage the Podcast, where between the spring, summer, fall, and autumn courts, we generally prefer the food court because we're getting a little hungry. This episode was made possible by Sean Gallagher, Oracle of the Dominion of Tusk, which gives control over elephants; Benjamin Bendelow, Oracle of the Dominion of Rusks, which generates tasty and shelf-stable biscuits; Buck Gregory, Oracle of the Dominion of Musk, which grants control over musk deer and muskrats; Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Dominion of Brusk, which can cause people to suddenly act gracelessly; Guy Stewart, Oracle of the Dominion of Lawn, making them the envy of great swathes of North American dads; Josh Hillrup, Oracle of the Dominion of Prawn, which grants them control over large shrimp; Puka G, Oracle of the Dominion of John. They know what that means. Jay Widener, Oracle of the Dominion of Kites, which is powerful on breezy spring days and grants control over electricity in Philadelphia. Mikhail, Oracle of the Dominion of Hoplite, which gives him access to the citizen soldiers of ancient Greece. And the crew of Erebus, Oracle of the Dominion of Whey, giving control over cheese production. That was intended to rhyme with dawn, day, dusk, and night, and I'm going to put the rhyming ones on hold for a while. Also thanks to Archmaster Andrew Endelstein, Archmaster Brad of the Blue, Archmaster Bubba the Pale One, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Semsek, Archmaster Jason Vines, Archmaster Morgan Aran, and Archmaster Nathan Weaver, as well as Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Chris Blake, Sinchotis, Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwink, Fragerrock, George Laura, Henry Kraft, Ia Bolt, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jake Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, John Magnuson, Joel Andes, Laws and Stuff, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leroy Bryce, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nathan Weaver, Nabero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Pax Cow, Rachel Grace, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kennedy, Samuel Tobin, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shout-out this week is to Henry Kraft, for whom I have composed 2 limericks. In a podcast world filled with glee, Henry Kraft's support set us free. With kindness he shone, like a mic brightly on, empowering each guest in host's spree. When the sound waves seemed hard to align, Henry Kraft's backing divine was so fine. With each episode's tale, his generosity set sail. We're grateful. Our gratitude will ne'er decline. Thank you, Henry. Rather listen on YouTube? Search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. Mage the Podcast is also on Mastodon at dice.camp/@magethepodcast, as well as on Threads as Mage the Podcast. If you like us, give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to Mage the Podcast for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.